The Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is an international organisation of journalists rooting out stories of bribery, coercion, fraud, hidden cash stashes and dirty deals. On the front page of its website this week, bribery in Bosnia, cocaine trafficking across the Atlantic, Russian propaganda and a banking clearinghouse that helped dodgy customers move their money across the world. That was based in Hamilton, New Zealand. I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the Kiwi company that moved hundreds of millions of dollars for clients who were later convicted of financial crimes. No action has been taken against it, in spite of significant concerns from the Department of Internal Affairs. We also look at the light-touch financial regulations that allowed it to set up shop, which haven't changed. Gareth Vaughan is the editor of interest.co.nz and has been working on this story for 10 years. It's complicated, dense, and the fact-checking has been off the planet. The events relating to the business dealings of Worldclear Limited happened between 2014 and 2018 and made the news when a former staff member, Richard Whittam, was arrested in Singapore in 2018.
He reached out to me initially, not that long after he had been arrested in Singapore. He had clearly seen some of my stories, I think one in particular where I wrote about his company. So he was brought in as a Worldclear employee to try and help them open bank accounts primarily in the US, and that didn't succeed, that didn't work, because Worldclear was struggling to get banks, or keep banks, and then to get banks, because it wanted to have bank accounts that it could move customers' money through.
Right, so this was the whole premise of its business, right?
Yeah.
That it moved money around the world for customers who might have otherwise found that difficult.
Yes. So this was the premise, and they had been struggling to keep bank accounts, and then they were struggling to get new ones. And so Richard was brought in. He was as a guy with a background in sales, and he would, cold call banks, particularly in the US, and try and line up accounts for Worldclear. This didn't succeed. So then David Hillary, who's the managing director of Worldclear, and Richard decided that Richard would establish a company in which he was the shareholder and director called T1 Holdings. And this company Worldclear would be able to use this company's bank accounts to move its money. So
what was the reservations from banks to dealing with Worldclear?
Look, I think there were a few. So what Hillary said at the time was that Worldclear was classed as a remittance company under anti-money laundering rules. And at that time, banks were very wary and concerned about the remittance sector, which is true. I mean, the anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism law took effect in New Zealand in 2013. So if you're talking about sort of 2015, 2016, the earlier days of Worldclear, that law was still very new, bedding in, and a lot of genuine remittance companies that were simply sending money, say from New Zealand's Pacifica community back to people in the South Pacific Islands, were struggling to retain bank accounts. So there was an element of that going on, but also, I mean, Worldclear, from what our experts that we spoke to have told us, from what I've seen, and from also what the Department of Internal Affairs, which was Worldclear's anti-money laundering supervisor, have said, is it was a pretty unique business model that they were operating in New Zealand, within a New Zealand context at least.
Well, what made them think that it would be a going concern? They clipped the ticket on these transactions, but why couldn't companies do that themselves?
Well, that's a good question, and I mean, obviously, Hillary has said that they worked with entities that other banks wouldn't necessarily have. So perhaps it was the type of operation, the jurisdiction they were from, various things. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, I think, for that, yeah. Legitimate reasons. Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think some of them are certainly legitimate, yeah. But I think with just back to Richard Whittam, so in, I think it was June or July 2018, I wrote a story about T1 Holdings, and I guess to me this was a strange relationship, that this company A is struggling to keep or open bank accounts, so an employee sets up another company that it can use to move money. So I guess, for me, having written quite a lot about anti-money laundering requirements, I wrote a story that was kind of focused on this, and I went to the Reserve Bank and I asked them, why are New Zealand banks allowing, company A to move money through companies B's accounts? And the RBNZ made some comments, well, they probably didn't realise that the T1, that T1 holdings linked back to Worldclear. So I think that was the story I think that Richard saw, and that was probably something that other media at the time who'd covered it hadn't really looked at. It was just this fascinating tale of New Zealand man arrested in Singapore and charged with stealing all this money. And that was part of the story, but it wasn't. I didn't think it was the whole story.
At what stage did you realise that you had something quite complex and big on your hands?
Also, Richard provided the data to me in, I believe from memory, April 2024. So obviously, he was released from Changi Prison in 2021, and things had largely gone quiet with Worldclear well before 2024. So I sort of started looking at it, and I just realised there's a lot here. This is about events that happened a few years ago. It is undoubtedly going to be interesting. I had no idea of the scale of it, so I didn't realise the business had been anywhere near as big as it actually was in terms of the volumes of, we're talking tens of millions of dollars and various currencies and customers literally from every corner of the world.
And yet it's on the 10th floor of an office block in Hamilton.
Yeah, and a relatively small corner of the 10th floor from what I understand as well. And so, there are documents in the leak that are in Russian, there are documents in Spanish. There was one I came across that was actually in both Russian and Spanish. So, obviously I can look at Google Translate and I can and there's names of oligarch from Belarus and things like this. There's companies in Cyprus and other places. There's no way I can put all this together myself. So, I guess my options were, one, okay, I'm like, I've got a lot on. We described Worldclear in the first story as a tiny New Zealand company. Well, interest.co.nz is even smaller than Worldclear. So there's only sort of, half a dozen or so of us who are sort of the journalist side of the business, covering the financial news in New Zealand.
So why don't you say to yourself, oh, look, it's too much for me. We've got more news to fill the pages. We'll just it happened a long time ago, we'll flag it.
Yeah, well, this was the thing. I guess I just I weighed it up over a period of a few months, actually, because one of the things going on at the time was the Commerce Commission's market study into banking competition, and then the government also launched a select committee inquiry into banking competition. Now, that's like an issue that I've written about for donkey's years and was a real core issue for us. So that was dominating my time, editing my team's stories, that was dominating my time. So I kind of did just basically procrastinate. And then I thought, well, I've kind of got two options. One, I can write a story and I can say, person A, B, and C and company, E, F, and G, they were Worldclear customers, but I can't really say a lot about why or what they were doing. And I thought, well, what value does that add about a company that stopped trading a few years ago? What's that going to really? It's not going to move the needle. It's not going to, not going to do a lot. So then I thought, well, I knew, the OCCRP. I had followed some of the
Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
Yes, give them their full name,
which is an international.
Yeah, it's an international organisation of investigative journalists. It's a real global network of journalists. Their headquarters is in Amsterdam, but they've got people based all over the place, and they work with partners in lots of different countries as well. So they work with other media partners in other parts of the world. And I had followed some of their work over the years, and I knew in particular they had a real strength in Eastern Europe. And I knew there was some interesting stuff in this leak from that part of the world. So I thought, well, I'll reach out to them and see if they're interested.
And they were.
They were.
Interest.co.nz applied for a Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative grant and got more than $76,000 to hire temporary cover so that Gareth could spend more time pursuing the story. The OCCRP got serious about it too and brought in international partners to dig into it, including Belarusian journalists who work in exile. Now, important to note, Worldclear has never been convicted of anything. There's no evidence they knowingly facilitated financial crimes.
And David Hillary, obviously the managing director, he denies, that they did anything wrong. In fact, I could probably be a good idea if I just read you what he said. So So David Hillary, who's a former financial advisor, denied any wrongdoing by himself or the firm, saying neither had ever knowingly or recklessly facilitated criminal offending, acted for the purpose of assisting any person to commit an offence, or designed or operated services for the purpose of concealing the source, destination, or beneficial connection of illicit funds. And they've not been prosecuted by anybody either. So you do need to add that.
Yeah. But DIA, Department of Internal Affairs, has looked at their business model and had, making sure that they've been ticking all the right boxes. What did they find?
Yeah, so the Department of Internal Affairs was their supervisor under anti-money laundering, countering financing terrorism laws. And they did 2 on-site inspections. And so they did one in 2015 when the firm was relatively new, and then they did a second one in 2018 at the height of Worldclear's operations in March 2018. And the report found Worldclear not to be in compliance with several aspects of anti-money laundering rules. So, David Hillary has heavily contested this report, which we have reported in our story, and I'd sort of suggest anyone who wants to know more about the ins and outs of the report and David Hillary's response, and then the DIA's subsequent response, read that story. But yeah, they did say they were non-compliant in a series of areas, and we shared some of the data with a couple of local experts. So one was Fiona Hall, who's a barrister who specialises in anti-money laundering legislation, and Martin Dilley, who is an anti-money laundering auditor and consultant, both vastly experienced, really top of their professions. And they were quite gobsmacked with how critical the DIA's report was. So based on the report, they thought there was reason for the DIA to have taken things further. The DIA didn't. And certainly one of the key reasons they say is because Worldclear subsequently was winding down its operations after Richard Whitham got arrested in Singapore, so in the later part of 2018 into 2019.
So the fact that they were dealing in literally hundreds of millions of dollars from this tiny little firm, did that ring any alarm bells, or does this happen all the time? I
think as someone who has covered financial journalism for a long time, you do get a bit immune to the value. Values put on things. Yeah. I can remember years ago when I worked in London, I was covering what was then the biggest, corporate merger of all time, and it was, several $100 billion or whatever it was then, and there's been heaps a lot bigger since. So there are vast sums of money that are moving around the world all the time, for lots of different reasons. But I think for a small New Zealand financial service provider from an office in Hamilton, it was quite surprising, I think, to discover the scale of this business.
And you did find out that some of the shareholders had previous financial convictions, but it's not incumbent on companies like Worldclear to check their backgrounds. Is that right?
So I think it's more a case that New Zealand authorities don't vet the minority shareholders of companies. So
they do that in other countries?
Well, yes, I think some do that. New Zealand's regulations in this area have come in for some criticism from the global anti-money laundering watchdog, which is called the Financial Action Task Force. So they do these evaluations of countries every few years, and the last one they did of New Zealand was in 2021. And one weakness that they have flagged is that there's no requirement for a financial service provider, a company like Worldclear, to vet minority shareholders. So, you had this guy he was then called Carl Michael Magnuson. He's subsequently gone to Mikael Magnuson. And he actually, while he was a Worldclear shareholder, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison in Panama on money laundering charges. Now, he'd left Panama by that point, and he's now living in Stockholm in his native Sweden. And there's an Interpol red notice that's been out for him since 2023. But Sweden will not extradite its citizens to countries outside the European Union. So he's sitting there in Stockholm Like as our partner at Matthias Carlson at Expressen, who was he was our key Magnuson expert because he's been tracking him for
he's in Sweden.
He's a Swede as well. And he wrote in one of his articles that he's written that, the people who were supposed to be keeping an eye on what Magnuson was up to were literally a few blocks away from where Magnuson's been living and had no idea he was even there. So,
oh, gosh.
Wow. Yeah. And then the second minority shareholder is a Venezuelan guy called Arturo Jose Trujillo Villalobos. So we discovered that he had in fact been convicted in 1999 of conspiracy to sell forged Venezuelan government bonds, which, is an unusual crime, I would have thought. But they owned their holdings in Worldclear through companies. So Magnuson had a Seychelles company and Trujillo had a company in Hong Kong. So when you look up the New Zealand Companies Office, you'll see their company names rather than their individual names.
Now, New Zealand is known as one of the easiest places in the world to do business, and our light touch regulation has a lot to do with that.
The World Bank used to do this ease of doing business survey, and New Zealand was always at the top of it. This is, New Zealand was viewed, out of 183 economies, New Zealand was the easiest place in which to start a company.
That's very attractive.
It's very attractive for business people, right? So anyone who wants to set up a company, legitimate business, it's fantastic. It's great and it's brilliant. But it does mean that, there may be people out there whose, reasoning may not be completely wholesome. It's easy for them to do as well. So Worldclear registered as a New Zealand company, and then it registered as a New Zealand financial service provider. And registering as a financial service provider of itself doesn't mean you're actually regulated. That's a separate issue. So there are some areas where you can register as a New Zealand financial service provider and provide certain financial services internationally, and you're not actually regulated in New Zealand. So effectively, what they were able to do is they weren't a bank. They didn't do anything wrong in the way they set the company up at all. They followed all the rules. And you can effectively operate as a bank internationally, but you're obviously not licensed by the Reserve Bank. So you're not, officially a bank, but you can offer the same type of services internationally. So this is, by international standards, this is quite light touch. And so, Michael Magnuson, who prior to his days as a Worldclear shareholder, he had a company and corporation business, and he incorporated a lot of New Zealand financial service providers on behalf of clients around the world. And he actually wrote a book in 2013 that was called How to Start a Bank with $1,000, the land without a banking law. This was about New Zealand.
Wow. Have we still got that light touch regulation that would allow the Worldclear case to replicate itself?
So you could set up in the same way today as Worldclear did. You could set up as a company and register as a financial service provider. Now, there may be closer oversight of you today. Also, one of our experts we spoke to, said he just didn't think banks would take on a company like this today. Now, obviously, going back 10 years or so when Worldclear was getting into business, they did get bank accounts, but then they struggled to keep them. So I don't think a lot has changed in terms of how you could set up. And obviously, one of the things is that the way that people move money is constantly evolving too, because obviously, in the days of Worldclear, cryptocurrency was around, and in the leak, there are a few companies who operated in that space.
Including Kim.com's crypto business Bitcash. He had stepped down as a director by the time it became a Worldclear customer, and it's since gone into liquidation.
But now there's a lot more of that type of thing going on. So I guess there's constant evolution in how we move money as well. So if you're sort of trying to keep up with that, it's always going to be a challenge.
Yeah. And Worldclear's demise, if you like, it did seem like more of a fading away than a crash. They basically just didn't re-register, is that right?
Yeah, so they basically went off the financial service providers register, of their own volition in early 2019. It's still a registered company, although they haven't filed an annual return since late 2024. So the company's registrar has actually started the process of deregistering Worldclear. But I found out through an Official Information Act request to MB that Inland Revenue has opposed the deregistration. So, of course, Inland Revenue never tell you why. But so it's
presumably it's so that they can still get money out of them.
well, there must be a reason.
It is a strange type of business. You know, you say in your story that using firms like this are slower and more expensive. So wouldn't the very nature of the transactions that it completes for people be suspicious? Or are there still legitimate reasons to operate through a company like this?
Well, I think there's a really good example in our story, and it's a British man called Gunther Klar. He came to Worldclear through actually Worldclear's customer, Global Fidelity Bank, which is was a bank from the Cayman Islands. He was a Global Fidelity Bank customer that they brought to Worldclear, and he used Global Fidelity's Worldclear account to move money. So he was doing significant transactions. So there's a $2 million loan, there's a $1 million payment from him to him, using two separate addresses at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Dubai, which has really jumped out at us. Like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of personal transactions. So there's flower purchases at a florist in Manchester. There's school fees for a high school in Manchester. There's flights for children to go from the UK to Sydney, this type of thing. There's a purchase of shoes in there. And we're looking at this, and we talked to Martin Dilley about this, the expert that I mentioned before. And, he said, there's so many easier ways to do this. I mean, this is a guy who's split his time between the UK and the Middle East. He's moving his money through a Cayman Islands bank and a New Zealand account on the other side of the world. Like, why would you do that? It would be much easier to buy the flowers or the tickets, the air tickets for your kids to go to Sydney on your credit card or through a local bank account. So it does raise the question of why is someone doing this? It's slower and it's more expensive to do it this way than it would be to just use your credit card or go through a local bank. So, I mean, at the time, he hadn't been convicted of anything, but subsequently he was convicted in the Cum-Ex tax fraud scandal in Europe, and he's now in jail in Luxembourg.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that the fact-checking involved in producing this story has been incredible. And here's an example.
We obviously spent a lot of time looking at the documentation, checking it out, making sure that it was real and that it was, viable. I'll give you an example of how thorough it was. So just a few days before we were due to publish the story, the key OCCRP fact checker who'd been working on the story had sort of told us that with Richard Whittam, so he doesn't feature prominently in the first story. There's just a little bit about him, but obviously we talk about how he was in Changi Prison in Singapore, and we have all sorts of court documents from Singapore relating to him, his court case in Singapore, but none of them specifically said he had been in Changi Prison, even the sentencing submissions we had. And so she was saying, well, we're going to have to say, he says he was in Changi Prison. And I was just like, oh my God, no, I don't want to do this. I want to really nail this. So basically I talked with one of the OCCRP editors who's based in Sydney, and I said, look, can we get someone in Singapore just to help us? Because it's, as an outsider, media outsider, trying to get official information out of Singapore is really difficult. So he said, can we get someone in Singapore to help with this? So he said, yeah, look, see if Richard will sign, a letter giving you permission to access his court records. So I did, and he did. And so we sent this off to a journalist at the Straits Times in Singapore, and he went to the Singapore Prison Service, and they confirmed, yes, he was in Changi Prison between these dates. So we were able to take out the two words, he says, and just...
No fudging.
No. So that was the level of fact checking and detail that was worked to. So yeah, look, so that takes time.
And did you speak to David Hillary?
Look, we contacted him and we offered him an interview, and he asked for us to send our questions in writing. So we've had email correspondence with him. So the OCCRP's approach is, you lay out, look, this is what we've found, this is what we are proposing that we want to report. Let us know if anything needs to be corrected, and comment on what we've got to say. and then we put some questions to him separately. So we went through this process, and we went back to him, I think, 3 or 4 times with different questions, and he answered. Some of them he answered, some of the questions he didn't answer, some of the topics he commented on, some he didn't comment on. But he certainly did respond to us.
Okay. What's he doing now?
So last I heard, he was actually studying law at Waikato University.
Oh, okay, not far from his old office.
No.
Right. That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders, and I'm Alexia Russell. Thanks to Gareth Vaughan, who says there's more to come on this story on interest.co.nz.